Now there's this passage in, I believe it's in First Peter, right? That we will share in his nature. Second Peter, okay, that we will share in his nature. That comes into this conversation,
Well,
or
yeah,
at
2
least it
Peter 1
has in
4
my.
says that we are called to be partakers of the divine nature. Interestingly, that is one of the common proof texts for the doctrine of deification, but that is not actually one of the original proof texts for the doctrine. So it may be the most commonly one cited now,
Mm-hmm.
but that really began with Cyril of Alexandria. Prior to Cyril, a few church fathers cited it here and there, named most notably Origen, but it was not the primary proof text as this doctrine was first being articulated amongst the church fathers. And there are some who dispute whether it really should be a deification proof text. One of the things I think that's important to note is this notion is not dependent upon a particular text. It certainly is not dependent on only one or two texts.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes theologians dismiss it, because they say, well, where's the biblical evidence? All you've got is 2 Peter 1 4, Psalm 82 6, behold, I said you are God, sons of the Most High, all of you, and maybe 1 John 3 2, when he returns, referring to Jesus, we shall see him and we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And I think it's important to note that no, this is a doctrine that is tapping into very important and deep biblical themes. And when we look at how the church fathers use Psalm 82 6, which was their favorite proof text, they're not using it simply because of the word God. In fact, that's secondary to their interests. For them, they read that psalm in light of pre-existing Jewish interpretations that connected the declaration there to the Garden of Eden and to God's speaking to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai, and also hinting toward the Messianic age. And the key line in the psalm for the early Christians was, behold, you are sons of the Most High, sons of the Most High. And they interpreted that as a kind of declaration of God's intentions for the creation of humanity and a prediction of what God would do in the restoration of humanity in the Messianic age. Namely, he would make human beings to be sons and daughters of God, sons of the Most High. The word gods in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, theoi, was clearly seen as synonymously parallel to sons of the Most High. Right. So in Psalm 82, if you know anything about Hebrew poetry, you know that you always want to look out for synonymous parallelism, antithetical parallelism, synthetic parallelism, and so forth. And in this particular verse, sons of the Most High, gods, are synonymously parallel. And the early fathers are, of course, thinking in Greek, writing in Greek, and they draw on the broad semantic range that the Greek word theos has as an attributive term that is frequently a simple synonym with immortality, athanatos, often used synonymously with the concept of incorruption, aphthartos, with gloriousness, right, doxos, with blessedness, makarios.
Mm-hmm.
And the early Christians read their New Testament very carefully, and they came across the Beatitudes, where Jesus talks about all the different ways in which the redeemed will be blessed, right? And one of those is that we are going to be called sons of God, right? So that sonship language and blessedness language together, right there in the Beatitudes, they think of this as a kind of fulfillment of Psalm 82 6. They look at Paul's doctrine of being adopted to divine sonship, sharing in the very sonship of Jesus himself. And they say, well, what does that look like for us ultimately? Well, it's being resurrected from the dead just as he was resurrected. And the Apostle Paul describes that resurrection body in terms of three particular attributes in 1 Corinthians 15. First, he says that we are raised immortal. Secondly, incorruptible. Thirdly, glorious. And so, for a second century Greek speaking Christian, it would be very natural to read that language and say, well, what does it mean when Paul says we are raised immortal, incorruptible, and glorious? Well, it means that we are made theos in that attributive sense. Not that we become deities or objects of divine worship, but that we become partakers of God's own immortality, incorruption, and glory. And one of the reasons they drew that inference is they looked at 1 Timothy 6, where Paul says, God alone has immortality. So, if you put it in terms of premises, God alone has immortality. We are raised immortal. It must be that the immortality that we will share and participate in is none less than God's own immortality. It is God sharing divine life with those whom he has redeemed, bringing them into the fellowship of the Father, Son, and Spirit by pouring out his Spirit into our hearts as that down payment, that guarantee of what is to come, and uniting us with Christ himself in sonship. So he is the eternally begotten Son of God. We are the adopted sons of God. But Paul is very clear that we are co heirs with Christ, so that we receive the same inheritance that Jesus in his humanity has received from the Father.